In this episode, we focus on compliance exceptions, which are situations where an organization cannot or does not fully meet a requirement and must handle that gap in a disciplined, transparent way. Beginners sometimes hear the word exception and assume it means breaking the rules, but in mature governance, an exception is a formally managed risk decision. Exceptions can exist for many reasons, such as legacy systems that cannot be updated quickly, vendor constraints, mission needs, time-limited operational realities, or conflicts between requirements that cannot be resolved immediately. The danger is not that exceptions exist, because real organizations face real constraints. The danger is unmanaged exceptions that quietly become permanent, expand in scope, and create hidden risk while everyone assumes compliance is intact. Documenting exceptions with controls, workarounds, and risk context means describing exactly what is not met, why it is not met, what is being done to reduce risk in the meantime, and how the exception will be monitored and reviewed. The goal is to make exceptions visible and defensible, so the organization can operate responsibly without pretending it is meeting requirements it is not meeting. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A useful starting point is understanding the difference between an exception and a failure, because that difference is mostly about governance. A failure is when a requirement is not met and no structured decision has been made to manage the gap. An exception is when the gap is recognized, evaluated, approved by the right authority, and managed with conditions. This matters because auditors and leaders judge not only whether gaps exist, but whether the organization handles gaps responsibly. An exception process can demonstrate maturity if it is disciplined, time-bound, and paired with risk reduction. For beginners, it helps to see exceptions as a safety valve in governance. Without a safety valve, organizations might either stop operations unnecessarily or hide problems to avoid embarrassment. With a safety valve, organizations can continue operating while acknowledging risk and taking steps to reduce it. That acknowledgement is not weakness, it is honesty, and honesty is what allows risk management to work. The key is that exceptions must not be a loophole for avoiding hard work, because that creates paper compliance that collapses under scrutiny. Documenting an exception begins with a precise description of what requirement is not being met and what part of the organization is affected. Precision includes naming the specific control expectation, the system or process involved, and the scope of impact. It also includes the time period and the reason, because an exception that lasts a week is different from one that has existed for years. Beginners often document exceptions in vague language, such as "we cannot meet the requirement due to operational constraints," but that does not help anyone manage risk. A good exception record states what is missing or different, such as a specific validation step not being performed, a specific control not being implemented, or a specific evidence requirement not being met. Precision also includes boundaries, such as which environments are covered or which users are affected, because exceptions tend to grow if boundaries are unclear. When documentation is precise, the organization can assess risk accurately and can avoid the common problem of exceptions silently expanding far beyond the original intent. Risk context is the next essential element, because exceptions must be justified as risk decisions, not as convenience decisions. Risk context includes what could go wrong because the requirement is not met, who could be harmed, and what the likely impact would be if the risk materializes. It also includes how likely the risk is, based on factors such as system exposure, threat environment, and past incident history. Risk context should also include compliance consequences, such as potential audit findings, contractual issues, or regulatory exposure if the gap is discovered or if an incident occurs while the gap exists. For beginners, the key idea is that an exception is not just a note that something is missing. It is a statement that the organization understands the risk and is choosing to carry it for a defined reason. This is why exceptions must be approved by someone with authority to accept that risk. Without risk context, approvals become meaningless because decision-makers cannot understand what they are accepting. Controls and workarounds are what keep an exception from being a dangerous open hole, and this is where documentation must become practical. A workaround is a temporary method for achieving some part of the control objective when the normal requirement cannot be met. A compensating control is a different control that reduces the same risk, even if it does not match the original requirement exactly. For example, if a system cannot support a required access control mechanism immediately, a compensating control might involve narrowing network exposure, increasing monitoring, or restricting who can reach the system through operational procedures. If a process step cannot be performed on schedule, a workaround might include an alternate verification method or a temporary manual review with clear documentation. For beginners, it helps to see controls and workarounds as a way to reduce risk while the exception exists. The goal is not to perfectly replicate the original requirement, but to reduce risk to an acceptable level until the full requirement can be met. Documentation should state what the workaround is, who performs it, how often it is performed, and what evidence will show it happened. Exception documentation also needs to include a plan for resolution, because exceptions should not be forever by default. Resolution might mean implementing the original control, replacing the system, renegotiating a vendor agreement, or changing the process so the requirement can be met reliably. The plan should include target dates, milestones, and owners, because without these, exceptions tend to become permanent. For beginners, the key idea is that exceptions are justified by constraints, but constraints often change, and the organization must actively work toward compliance rather than accepting gaps indefinitely. A resolution plan also helps auditors and leaders see that the organization is not ignoring requirements. Instead, it is making a controlled, time-bound decision with a path to closure. This is especially important for high-risk exceptions, where the organization may need to demonstrate ongoing effort and oversight. A resolution plan turns the exception from a static risk into a managed project with accountability. Monitoring and review are another core part of documentation because risk and conditions change over time. A system that was low risk when an exception was approved might become higher risk later due to increased exposure, new threat patterns, or changed business reliance. Exception documentation should include review frequency, such as periodic reevaluation, and it should include triggers for reevaluation, such as a change in system environment or a new audit cycle. It should also define what metrics or observations will be used to monitor the exception, such as whether compensating controls continue operating or whether incidents or near misses are occurring. For beginners, it helps to see review as the mechanism that prevents exception drift. Drift is when an exception remains in place while the world changes, increasing risk quietly. Monitoring makes risk visible and supports responsible decisions, such as accelerating remediation or strengthening compensating controls when risk rises. Without review, exceptions become hidden technical debt with compliance consequences. Documentation must also include authorization and traceability, because exceptions are governance decisions that require accountability. Authorization means the right person or group approves the exception, based on authority to accept risk. Traceability means the organization can show who approved it, when, why, and under what conditions. Traceability also includes linking the exception to the specific requirement, system, and risk register entries, so it is not isolated. For beginners, this is the idea that exceptions should be auditable decisions. An organization that cannot show approval and context looks careless, while an organization that can show disciplined exception management looks responsible even if gaps exist. This is not about paperwork for its own sake. It is about proving that the organization recognizes gaps and manages them consciously. Traceability also helps with future decisions, because new leaders can understand the history and rationale rather than inheriting mysterious exceptions with no explanation. Finally, documenting exceptions well requires careful language, because the document should communicate risk without exaggeration and without minimizing. It should avoid vague phrases that hide impact, and it should avoid emotional language that triggers panic. It should state facts about what is missing, what compensating controls exist, what residual risk remains, and what the plan is for resolution. It should also be clear about what the exception does not cover, because boundaries prevent uncontrolled expansion. For beginners, the key idea is that exception documentation is a communication tool. It explains the gap to auditors, leaders, and future team members, and it supports consistent behavior while the exception exists. When documentation is clear, people are less likely to improvise unsafe shortcuts because they understand the approved workaround. When documentation is unclear, people invent their own workarounds, and that increases risk. Good documentation therefore reduces both compliance risk and operational risk. Documenting compliance exceptions with controls, workarounds, and risk context is the discipline of managing unavoidable gaps without creating hidden exposure or false confidence. An exception is different from an unmanaged failure because it is recognized, scoped precisely, approved by the right authority, and governed with conditions. Strong documentation states exactly what requirement is not met, why the gap exists, and what risk it introduces, including compliance consequences and business impact. It then describes compensating controls and workarounds in practical terms with owners, frequency, and evidence so risk is reduced while the exception remains. A resolution plan, monitoring cadence, and review triggers prevent exceptions from becoming permanent by default and ensure changing conditions are addressed responsibly. Authorization and traceability make the decision auditable and credible, while clear language and boundaries prevent exception sprawl. When exceptions are documented and managed this way, the organization can operate responsibly under real constraints, maintain trust with auditors and stakeholders, and steadily move towards stronger compliance and lower risk over time.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.